Story number 1. The House of Eternal Light. It was supposed to be a harmless adventure, a way to escape the suffocating quiet of our small Icelandic village during Christmas. The year was 1983, and our group of 5, Asa, Ellen, Jarton, Arner, and me were restless teenagers looking for anything to make the holiday memorable. The idea to explore the old abandoned house on the edge of the lava fields wasn't mine. But when Jarton brought it up, there was an instant buzz of excitement among us. The house had been empty for decades, its previous owners long gone under circumstances no one seemed willing to discuss. Locals avoided it, and children told stories about seeing strange lights glowing from the windows at night. To us, it was the perfect mix of mystery and danger. We set out after dinner, wrapped in heavy coats and scarves against the biting wind. The northern lights danced faintly in the sky as we trudged through the snow-covered fields, our boots crunching against the frozen ground. The house came into view slowly, a dark silhouette against the endless white. And then we saw it, a faint, eerie glow emanating from the windows. Probably just moonlight, Arner said, though his voice lacked conviction. No one else spoke. The glow wasn't steady. It pulsed, like the flicker of a candle fighting against a draft. My stomach tightened, but I pushed the feeling aside. We had come too far to back out now. The closer we got, the stranger the glow became. It wasn't the warm yellow of firelight or the cold white of the moon. It was something in between, pale, unnatural luminescence that seemed to shift and shimmer with every step we took. When we reached the porch, Jarton was the first to push open the creaking door. The light spilled out into the snow, bathing us in its strange glow. It wasn't warm. In fact, the air felt even colder inside, as if the house itself was leaching the warmth from our bodies. The interior was surprisingly intact. Old furniture covered in sheets stood like ghosts in the corners, and the wooden floor groaned under our weight. But what caught our attention immediately was the portrait hanging above the stone fireplace. It was a large painting of a woman, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. She wore a simple white dress, but her expression was anything but simple. Her eyes were sharp, almost predatory, and her lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. As I stared at the painting, I could have sworn her eyes flicked toward me. Did she just move? Asa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No one answered, but we all felt it. The eyes in the portrait seemed alive, following us as we moved around the room. "Let's keep going," Jarton said, his bravado faltering slightly. He led the way deeper into the house, but the rest of us hesitated. Something about the painting felt wrong, as if it were watching not just our movements, but our thoughts. The whispers started when we reached the dining room. First, I thought it was the wind, but as we stood there, the sound grew clearer, soft, disjointed murmurs that seemed to come from every corner of the room. Ellen clutched my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "We shouldn't be here," she said. The light grew brighter, bathing the room in its unnatural glow. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. One of the chairs at the long dining table tipped over with a crash, though none of us had touched it. "We need to leave," I said, my voice trembling, but Jarton shook his head. "Let's check upstairs first," he said, though even he looked scared now. Reluctantly, we followed him up the narrow staircase. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the house itself was warning us to turn back. When we reached the second floor, the light dimmed, leaving us in an eerie half-darkness. The hallway was lined with doors, each one slightly ajar. As we passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was standing just beyond the threshold, watching us. The air was thick with an oppressive stillness, broken only by the sound of our footsteps and the occasional creak of the floorboards. At the end of the hallway was a single closed door. Jarton hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The whispers stopped, and then, suddenly, the door slammed open. We all screamed as the glow from inside the room flooded the hallway. It was blinding, more intense than anything we'd seen before. For a moment, I thought I saw figures in the light, vague, humanoid shapes that flickered like dying flames. The air was filled with a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Run!" Arner shouted, and we didn't need to be told twice. We stumbled down the stairs, tripping over each other in our desperation to escape. The whispers returned, louder and angrier, chasing us as we burst out into the freezing night. We didn't stop running until we were back in the village, gasping for breath and trembling with fear. When we finally looked back, the house was dark again, its glow extinguished as if it had never been there. The next morning, we tried to convince ourselves it had all been a bad dream. But when Kjartan went back to retrieve his scarf, he returned pale and shaking. The house was gone. Where it had stood, there was only a patch of bare, undisturbed snow. To this day, none of us can explain what happened that night. We've told the story to others, but no one believes us. The house, the painting, the whispers, they've all become part of local legend, dismissed as the overactive imaginations of bored teenagers. But I know what I saw, and every Christmas, when the nights are long and the snow lies thick on the ground, I think about that house and the terrible light that filled it. I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for another group of curious souls to stumble across it. And I pray they have the sense to stay away. Story number 2. The Silent Visitor. I've never liked Christmas. I think it's because of what happened in 1995. That was the year I stopped believing in the magic of the holiday. It was the year I realized that not every story about Christmas is a cheerful one. I was 8 years old, living with my parents in a small house in rural Texas. My dad worked long hours at a factory, and my mom was a nurse who often worked night shifts. That year, she'd promised to be home for Christmas Eve, but a last-minute call meant she wouldn't be back until morning. My dad tried to make up for it by letting me stay up late to watch a Christmas movie with him. By the time the credits rolled, I could barely keep my eyes open. "Time for bed, kiddo," Dad said, carrying me upstairs. I woke up a few hours later, startled by a sound I couldn't quite place. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, a faint rustling, like someone moving around downstairs. I sat up in bed and rubbed my eyes, straining to hear. Came again, this time louder, the unmistakable creak of floorboards. "Dad," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. My heart pounded as I slipped out of bed, the cold wooden floor sending a shiver up my spine. I tiptoed to the door and peeked out into the hallway. The house was silent, except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. I told myself I was imagining things, but curiosity got the better of me. The staircase groaned under my weight as I crept downstairs, clutching the banister tightly. The living room was bathed in the soft glow of Christmas lights, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. At first, everything seemed normal. The stockings hung by the fireplace, and the tree sparkled with ornaments and tinsel. Then I saw him. He was standing near the fireplace, his back to me. At first, I thought it was my dad, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized this figure was taller, broader, too large to be my father. He wore a red suit, but it wasn't the cheerful, fluffy outfit you'd expect from Santa Claus. This one was faded and threadbare, as if it had been pulled from an attic after decades of neglect. "Santa," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure turned slowly, and my breath caught in my throat. His face was pale, almost waxy, with hollow cheeks and eyes that didn't seem to blink. His mouth was twisted into a smile, too wide, too stiff, like it had been painted on. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at me. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs wouldn't move. Then he took a step forward, and the wooden floor creaked under his heavy boots. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost mechanical. He raised a gloved hand and pointed at me, his smile never faltering. "Dad!" I finally managed to scream, my voice breaking the silence. I turned and bolted up the stairs, my heart racing as I scrambled back to my room. I slammed the door shut and threw myself under the covers, trembling uncontrollably. Footsteps echoed up the stairs, heavy and deliberate. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the blanket tightly, and prayed for it to stop. The footsteps reached my door and then nothing, just silence. When I finally opened my eyes, the house was still. The only sound was the faint hum of the heater kicking on. I lay there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, until exhaustion finally pulled me into a restless sleep. The next morning, I told my dad what had happened. He laughed it off, saying I must have had a bad dream. But when we went downstairs, his smile faded. The front door was wide open, snow blowing into the entryway. We stepped outside, and that's when we saw them, footprints. They were massive, far too large to belong to my dad, and they started at the living room window. The snow beneath the window was undisturbed, as if whoever or whatever had entered had stepped through solid glass. The footprints led across the yard and into the woods, where they disappeared among the trees. My dad called the police, but they didn't find anything. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone in the area. They chalked it up to a prank or a drifter passing through. But I knew better. For weeks, couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, sent me into a panic. I kept the lights on, and I refused to go near the living room at night. My parents tried to reassure me, but they couldn't explain the footprints, or why the snow outside the window hadn't been disturbed. Years later, I still think about that night. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it was just a bad dream or a trick of the light. But I can't forget the way he moved, the way his smile never faltered, the way his hollow eyes seemed to pierce right through me. Every Christmas, I wonder if he'll come back, if I'll wake up to find him standing in the corner of my room, smiling that terrible, frozen smile. And every Christmas, I sleep with the lights on, just in case. Story number 3. The Midnight Hymn. I wasn't supposed to be there that night. My family had moved to the small English village of East Haven just a month before Christmas in 1909, and the townsfolk were eager to welcome us. My mother insisted I join the midnight mass at St. Bridget's, the ancient stone church at the edge of the village. I wasn't much for religion, but the prospect of sitting through hours of solemn hymns and sermons seemed a small price to pay for fitting into our new home. The church was breathtaking, even in its disrepair. Its towering spires reached toward the heavens, the stained glass windows casting fractured light across the snow-covered grounds. Yet, there was an unease about it, a weight in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The townsfolk whispered about St. Bridget's, though they never spoke openly. A few muttered about old curses, others about strange occurrences during Christmas masses. But when I pressed for details, their faces would pale, and they'd mutter prayers under their breath. The mass began at 10 p.m., and I arrived late, slipping into a pew near the back. Candles flickered along the aisles, casting long shadows that danced across the stone walls. The priest's voice echoed through the cavernous space as he led the congregation in hymns and prayers. For a time, everything felt normal, until midnight, when the church bells struck 12. A chill swept through the room. The candles flickered violently, and the priest faltered mid-sentence, his voice trailing off into silence. That's when we heard it. The singing came from the back of the church, a hauntingly beautiful melody that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't part of the mass. This was something else entirely. The voice was high and pure, like that of a young girl, and it echoed through the church as if carried by the wind. Everyone turned to look, but there was no one there, at least, not at first. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the shadows at the far end of the nave, just beyond the last row of pews. It was a girl, or at least it looked like one. She wore a white dress that seemed to shimmer in the dim light, and her long, dark hair hung loose around her face. She stood perfectly still, her head bowed as she continued to sing. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was her song, growing louder and more sorrowful with each passing second. It was mesmerizing, yet deeply unsettling, like hearing a lullaby sung at a funeral. One of the parishioners, a man named Mr. Carver, finally broke the spell. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. He stood and took a hesitant step toward her. The girl stopped singing. She lifted her head, and I felt my stomach drop. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were black pits of emptiness. When she looked at us, it was as if she saw through us, as if we were nothing more than shadows to her. Then she smiled. It was a small, faint smile, but it sent a wave of terror through the room. Without a word, she turned and began walking toward the altar. The sound of her footsteps echoed unnaturally loud, like the tolling of a distant bell. Several people whispered prayers, clutching their rosaries tightly, but no one dared to move. When she reached the altar, she stopped and turned to face us once more. Her lips parted, and she began to sing again, this time in a language I didn't recognize. The words were sharp and guttural, and they seemed to twist the air around her. The candles dimmed, and the temperature dropped so low I could see my breath. Mr. Carver stepped forward again, his face pale but determined. "This is a house of God," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "Whatever you are, you have no place here." The girl tilted her head, as if considering his words. Then she raised one hand and pointed at him. The air filled with an ear-splitting scream, though none of us opened our mouths. It was as if the church itself was crying out in pain. Mr. Carver clutched his chest and collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing violently. The congregation erupted into chaos, people screaming and pushing toward the doors. I stood frozen in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the girl. She was laughing now, a sound that sent icy tendrils of fear creeping down my spine. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I thought she was coming for me. But then she vanished. The candles flared back to life, and the warmth returned to the room. The silence was deafening. Mr. Carver's body lay still on the floor, his face twisted in a mask of terror. The priest knelt beside him, whispering prayers, but it was clear he was gone. The remaining parishioners fled the church, their faces pale and drawn. I lingered near the door, unable to shake the feeling that something was still watching us. When I finally stepped outside, the snow had stopped, and the village was eerily quiet. St. Bridget's was closed the next day. The priest claimed it was out of respect for Mr. Carver, but whispers spread through the village of other reasons, of strange marks found on the altar, of the lingering smell of burnt candles that wouldn't fade. The church never reopened. Over time, the villagers stopped talking about that night altogether, as if pretending it hadn't happened would make it go away. But I've never forgotten. I can still hear her song in my dreams, haunting and beautiful, echoing through the corridors of my mind. And sometimes, late at night, I see her face in the shadows, a pale figure with black, empty eyes, waiting patiently for the stroke of midnight. Story number 4. The Snowman. It was the winter of 1957, and our little village in the heart of Siberia was locked in an icy grip. Snowdrifts towered over fences, and the air was so cold that your breath crystallized the moment it escaped your lips. But it was Christmas, and no amount of frostbite could dim the holiday spirit. My father, always one to embrace the season, suggested we make a snowman after dinner. It was a simple, joyous act, one that brought a bit of warmth to the bitter cold. My younger sister, Nadia, and I helped roll the snow into 3 massive balls, stacking them carefully until the figure stood nearly as tall as my father. We gave it button eyes made from chunks of coal, a crooked carrot for a nose, and twigs for arms. My mother tied an old scarf around its neck, and Nadia insisted on giving it her favorite red cap. When we stepped back to admire our work, it almost seemed alive. That was before everything went wrong. The first sign that something was off came later that night. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, and the snow outside glittered under a pale moon. I was lying in bed, struggling to sleep, when I heard a noise, a soft crunching, like footsteps in the snow. I sat up and peered out the window, expecting to see my father checking on the livestock. Instead, I saw the snowman. It stood exactly where we had built it, at the edge of the yard, but its head was tilted. The coal eyes, which had been staring blankly into the distance, now seemed to be looking directly at the house, directly at my window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the wind had shifted the snow, or the scarf had tugged it slightly out of place. But then I saw the footprints. They were deep and distinct, leading from the snowman to our front porch. The path stopped there, at the door, but there were no prints leading away. I wanted to scream, to run and wake my parents, but fear kept me rooted in place. Instead, I crept back under my blankets and squeezed my eyes shut, praying for morning to come. When dawn finally broke, the footprints were gone, erased by fresh snowfall. I hesitated to say anything, worried my parents would dismiss it as a bad dream. Nadia, however, wasn't as restrained. Over breakfast, she announced that she'd heard someone tapping on her window during the night. It was probably the wind, my father said, though his brow furrowed. This old house creaks and groans in weather like this. But Nadia shook her head. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like fingers. That day, we tried to go about our usual routine, but something felt wrong. Even the animals seemed uneasy. The dogs refused to go outside, and the chickens huddled together in their coop, refusing to leave even when my father scattered feed. When night fell, the unease turned to dread. I lay awake, listening for the crunch of footsteps or the rattle of the wind. Just as I began to drift off, the sound came again, soft at first, then louder. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the house. I crept to the window and peeked through a crack in the frost-covered glass. The snowman was still there, but its head was tilted further now, as if straining to look at something just out of sight. The red cap was gone, and in its place was a jagged hole where the snow had been disturbed. And then I saw it. A shadow moved across the yard, tall and thin, dragging something behind it. I couldn't make out the details, but I knew it wasn't my father. The figure moved with an unnatural grace, its limbs jerking in strange, inhuman motions. It stopped at Nadia's window. I don't remember running to her room, only that I was suddenly there, throwing open the door and shaking her awake. She looked at me with bleary eyes, confused and annoyed, until we both heard it, a faint tapping, like knuckles rapping against glass. Nadia's face went pale, and she grabbed my arm. Together, we crept to the window and peeked outside. The snowman was gone. The yard was empty, save for a set of long, dragging footprints that led toward the forest. By morning, my father had had enough. He dismissed our stories as childish nonsense, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He took a shovel and marched out into the snow, determined to destroy the snowman once and for all. But when we reached the yard, there was nothing to destroy. The snowman was gone, leaving behind only a strange indentation in the snow where it had stood. The coal eyes and carrot nose were scattered nearby, as if they'd been ripped away. "See," my father said, forcing a laugh. "It's just snow. It probably collapsed under its own weight." But I knew better. The snowman hadn't collapsed. It had walked away. The days that followed were a blur of fear and sleepless nights. The strange noises continued, the footsteps, the tapping, the low, guttural whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. My mother burned the scarf and hat, hoping it would break whatever curse had settled over us. But it didn't help. One by one, the villagers began to notice things as well. Livestock went missing, their pens splattered with blood. A farmer claimed he saw a figure standing in his field at dusk, its coal eyes glowing red in the fading light. And then Nadia fell ill. It started with a fever, followed by strange, fitful dreams. She muttered in her sleep, words I couldn't understand, and her skin grew pale and cold as the snow outside. My mother wept, and my father prayed, but nothing seemed to help. And then, one night, she was gone. I woke to find her bed empty, the blankets thrown aside as if she'd left in a hurry. The window was open, snow drifting onto the sill, and outside, I saw her footprints leading toward the forest. I followed them, calling her name, but the wind swallowed my voice. The trees closed in around me, their branches heavy with snow. And then, in a small clearing, I saw it, the snowman. It was taller now, its body misshapen and uneven. The coal eyes had been replaced with something darker, something that gleamed in the moonlight, and atop its head was Nadia's red cap. I turned and ran, the sound of crunching snow echoing behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the house, slamming the door shut and collapsing onto the floor. My parents found me there hours later, trembling and incoherent. Nadia was never found. To this day, I don't know what we summoned that winter, what force had been awakened by our innocent play. The villagers avoid the forest now, and no one builds snowmen anymore. But on cold, quiet nights, when the wind howls through the trees, I swear I can still hear it, the soft crunch of footsteps, the rattle of coal in the snow, and I know it's watching. Story number 5. The Laugh in the Basement. Christmas of 1998 was meant to be a new beginning for my family. My parents had recently moved us from our cramped apartment in downtown Toronto to a spacious suburban home. It was the kind of house I'd only seen in Christmas movies, 2 stories, a yard big enough to build snowmen, and a massive spruce tree perfect for stringing lights. Everything about the house seemed perfect, except for the basement. It wasn't anything dramatic, like a boarded-up door or bloodstains on the walls. In fact, the basement was unfinished but otherwise ordinary, a concrete floor, exposed beams, and a single bulb dangling from the ceiling. But from the moment we moved in, I felt uneasy about it. The air down there was colder than the rest of the house, and it always smelled faintly of damp earth. No matter how much my mom cleaned, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a kid's overactive imagination. But that changed on Christmas Eve. The evening started like any other holiday. Mom cooked a feast, Dad brought out the eggnog, and my little sister, Emily, insisted on opening one present before bed. We were all laughing and relaxed, enjoying the kind of warmth that only comes during the holidays. Then, just as we were finishing dessert, we heard it, a laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, a high-pitched, giggling sound that echoed up from the basement. We all froze. Mom looked at Dad, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Did you hear that?" Dad nodded, his expression tightening. "Probably just the wind," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. But it wasn't the wind. The laugh came again, louder this time, and unmistakably coming from below. Dad stood, grabbing the flashlight he kept in the kitchen drawer. "Stay here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mom clutched Emily, who had gone pale, and I followed Dad to the basement door despite his warning. He opened the door slowly, and a rush of icy air spilled into the hallway. The laugh had stopped, but the silence was somehow worse. Felt heavy, oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. I said stay upstairs. Dad muttered, but he didn't push me away. We descended the wooden steps together, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The basement was empty, just as I expected. No intruders, no animals, no explanation for the noise. But as Dad swept the light across the room, the beam landed on something that made my stomach flip. The rocking chair. It had come with the house. An old wooden thing with chipped paint and frayed cushions. It had been shoved into a corner when we moved in. But now it sat in the middle of the room, and it was moving, back and forth, creaking softly as it rocked on the concrete floor. "Must have been a draft," Dad said, though his voice was shaky. He reached out and stopped the chair. his hand lingering on the worn armrest as if testing its weight. Nothing to worry about. We returned upstairs, but the festive mood had been shattered. Mom tried to distract us with carols and cocoa, but every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the whistle of the wind outside, set me on edge. When it was finally time for bed, I hesitated, lingering near the basement door. "Don't worry," Dad said, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. I locked it. That night, I dreamed of the rocking chair. I saw it moving on its own, faster and faster, until it tipped over with a deafening crash. I woke with a start, my heart racing, and realized it wasn't just the dream that had woken me. There was a sound coming from the basement, a low, rhythmic thumping, like someone tapping their fingers against the wall. I lay frozen in bed, my breath shallow, straining to hear. The tapping grew louder, then stopped abruptly, replaced by the soft creak of the rocking chair. And then the laugh returned. I wanted to scream, to wake my parents, but my voice wouldn't come. Instead, I pulled the covers over my head and prayed for it to stop. When morning came, I convinced myself it had all been a dream. But as we gathered around the tree to open presents, I noticed Dad was unusually quiet. His eyes kept drifting toward the basement door, his jaw clenched tight. That afternoon, when Mom took Emily to visit our grandparents, Dad pulled me aside. "You heard it, didn't you?" he asked. I nodded, my throat dry. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I thought it was just the wind, or maybe mice. But I went down there again last night after you all went to bed. The chair, it was rocking again, by itself." We decided to investigate together, this time in broad daylight. Armed with flashlights and a crowbar, we descended into the basement, determined to find some rational explanation. But no matter how thoroughly we searched, we found nothing. No drafts, no loose beams, no signs of rodents. And yet, the rocking chair had moved again. It now faced the stairs, as if watching us. Dad tried to laugh it off, but the sound was forced. He grabbed the chair and hauled it up the steps, muttering about donating it to a thrift store. That night, for the first time since we moved in, I fell asleep without hearing the laugh. But the peace didn't last. The next morning, the chair was back. It sat in the middle of the basement, its worn cushions sagging as if someone had been sitting in it all night. Dad swore he had left it at the curb for pickup, but there it was, as if it had never left. We didn't know what to do. Mom suggested burning it, but Dad refused, saying he didn't want to risk starting a fire. Instead, he moved it to the garage, chaining it to the wall like some kind of prisoner. For a while, things returned to normal. The house felt warm again, alive with the sounds of family and laughter. But I could never quite shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the rocking chair was waiting for us to let our guard down. Months later, when the snow had melted and the world seemed brighter, a moving truck arrived at our neighbor's house. The family who moved in had a little boy about Emily's age. I saw him playing in the yard one afternoon, and for a moment, I felt a pang of jealousy at his carefree innocence. Then I saw it. Sitting on their porch, facing the street, was the rocking chair, and I swear, as I turned away, I heard it creak. Story number 6. Krampus Visit. When I was a boy, the elders in our small Bavarian village would gather us around the fire on frigid December nights to share stories of Krampus. They would speak of his twisted horns, his cloven hooves, and the rattle of chains as he stalked the streets in search of naughty children. At the time, I dismissed the tales as mere folklore, a tool for keeping unruly kids in line during the holiday season. But there's a difference between a story and a warning. I learned that the hard way on a December night long ago, when the snow fell heavy and the wind howled through the Alps like a chorus of lost souls. It was Christmas Eve, 1992. And I had returned to my childhood village to spend the holidays with my family. After years of living in Munich, I had grown detached from the simple traditions of home. My parents were overjoyed to have me back, but the nostalgia I expected didn't come. Instead, I felt out of place, like an outsider looking in. That evening, the snowstorm rolled in with a ferocity I hadn't seen since I was a child. By nightfall, the village was blanketed in white, and the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the occasional gust of wind rattling the shutters. My younger cousin, Matthias, was especially restless. At 8 years old, he was too old for bedtime stories but too young to appreciate the warmth of an idle evening by the hearth. "Tell me about Krampus," he whispered, his wide eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "Is he real?" I chuckled and ruffled his hair. "Krampus is just a story, Matthias. He's not real." My grandmother, seated in her old rocking chair, frowned at me. "You shouldn't dismiss him so lightly," she said, her voice low and steady. "Krampus may not come for you, but for children who misbehave." Her gaze lingered on Matthias, who squirmed under the weight of her words. "I've been good," he insisted, though the nervous edge in his voice betrayed him. Grandmother said nothing more, but the tension in the room was palpable. I tried to laugh it off, but deep down, I felt a flicker of unease. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the wind carrying with it a faint, rhythmic clinking sound, like the rattle of chains. That night, couldn't sleep. My room was cold despite the fire we'd kept roaring all evening, and the sound of the wind outside was relentless. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled, a mournful, eerie cry that made my skin crawl. I got out of bed and went to the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of the storm's fury. What I saw instead chilled me to my core. A dark figure stood at the edge of the village square, partially obscured by the swirling snow. It was tall, inhumanly so, and hunched, its broad shoulders draped in what looked like a tattered cloak of fur. Long curved horns jutted from its head, and in one clawed hand, it clutched a bundle of chains that gleamed faintly in the moonlight. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then it moved. The creature began to prowl through the square, its movements deliberate and unnervingly silent. As it approached the houses, I saw it peer into windows, its glowing red eyes scanning the interiors. I pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding, as it paused outside my window. For what felt like an eternity, it stood there, its breath steaming in the cold air. Then, with a low growl, it turned and disappeared into the night. I wanted to convince myself it was a hallucination, a trick of the storm, but the sound of the chains still echoed in my ears. Gathering my courage, I crept downstairs to check on Matthias. The door to his room was ajar, and I peeked inside. The bed was empty. Panic surged through me as I raced outside, shouting his name. The snow was knee-deep, and the icy wind bit into my skin. But I didn't care. I followed a trail of small footprints leading away from the house, toward the forest at the edge of the village. The woods were dark and oppressive, the towering pines casting long shadows across the snow. The footprints led deeper and deeper, and with each step, my dread grew. I called out for Matthias again and again, but the only response was the wind. And then I heard it, the clinking of chains, louder now, accompanied by a deep, guttural growl. The trail ended in a small clearing, where the snow was disturbed as if something large had thrashed about. In the center of the clearing stood a tree, its gnarled branches heavy with icicles. Hanging from one of the branches was a sack, an old, weathered thing that writhed as though something inside was struggling. "Matthias!" I shouted, running toward it. The moment I touched the sack, the growling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I tore it open, my hands shaking, and found Matthias curled inside, his face pale and streaked with tears. He clung to me, sobbing, as I carried him back toward the village. But as we left the clearing, I glanced back and saw the creature watching us from the shadows. It didn't follow. It simply stood there, its glowing eyes burning into my soul. We returned to the house, where my frantic parents and grandmother enveloped Matthias in a flurry of blankets and questions. He refused to speak of what had happened, but later that night, as I tucked him into bed, He whispered for words that made my blood run cold. He said, "I'm next." I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and by morning, the storm had passed. The village square was bustling with life once more, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Years have passed since that night, but the memory lingers like a scar. Every Christmas Eve, I stay indoors, the doors locked and the windows shuttered, listening for the sound of chains rattling in the distance, because I know Krampus is still out there, stalking the snow-covered villages, searching for the next child to add to his collection, and he never forgets. Story number 7. The Haunting of the Lawson Farm. I first heard about the Lawson family massacre during a road trip through North Carolina. It was a chilly December evening, and I had stopped at a roadside diner near Germantown. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, was the one who brought it up. She'd noticed my out-of-state plates and asked if I was passing through or staying for the holidays. "Neither," I replied. "I'm just exploring." She smiled faintly and leaned against the counter. "If you're into stories, you might want to check out the old Lawson farm. But fair warning, it's not for the faint of heart." I raised an eyebrow. "What's the story?" Her smile faded. "It's where a man killed his whole family on Christmas Day back in 1929. They say the place is cursed, haunted by the ones he left behind." She wasn't lying. I arrived at the Lawson farm just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted fields. The farmhouse stood alone at the edge of the property, its windows dark and lifeless. The air was still, too still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. There was no wind, no rustling of trees, only the crunch of my boots on frozen ground. The house hadn't been lived in for decades, but it looked as though it had been frozen in time. The white clapboard exterior was weathered but intact, and a Christmas wreath still hung crookedly on the front door, its once green needles now brittle and brown. I hesitated before stepping inside. The story had unsettled me more than I cared to admit, but curiosity pushed me forward. I wasn't afraid of ghosts, or so I thought. The interior was cold and silent. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung like tinsel from the rafters. A single photograph sat on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, the Lawson family Christmas portrait. They stood stiffly in their Sunday best, their expressions solemn. Charles Lawson, the patriarch, stood at the center, his eyes dark and piercing. Beside him were his wife, Fanny, and their 6 children, ranging in age from 4 months to 17 years. There was something unsettling about the photo, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The children's smiles, what little there were, felt forced, their eyes hollow. It was as if they knew what was coming. The massacre had taken place in this very house. Charles had killed them all one by one with a shotgun, starting with his daughters near the barn and ending with his wife and baby inside the home. Afterward, he'd walked into the woods and taken his own life. As I stood there, staring at their faces, the room seemed to grow colder. A faint sound reached my ears, a soft, distant sobbing. I froze, my pulse quickening. It was coming from upstairs. I told myself it was just the wind, though deep down, I knew better. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed to the second floor, the sound of sobbing growing louder with each step. It led me to a small bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, and beyond it, the air felt heavy, oppressive. Inside, the room was empty, save for a small rocking chair by the window. It swayed gently, as if someone had just been sitting in it. The sobbing stopped the moment I stepped inside, replaced by a suffocating silence. Then I noticed the faint outline of footprints in the dust on the floor, small, barefoot prints leading to the chair. I backed out of the room, my heart hammering in my chest. Something wasn't right. The air felt charged, as if the house itself was alive, watching me. I made my way back downstairs, intending to leave, but as I reached the living room, the front door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my breath fogging in the cold air. The room seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, The photograph on the mantelpiece had changed. Charles Lawson's face was still there, but his eyes were fixed directly on me. His lips curled into a faint, menacing smile. The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the house, soft, deliberate, circling around me. Then came the whispers, low and guttural. They seemed to come from all directions at once. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. I wasn't welcome. I bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the air around me turned frigid. The walls seemed to close in, and for a moment, I thought I saw figures moving in the shadows, children, their faces pale and empty, their eyes accusing. You shouldn't have come here. The voice was loud and unmistakable, coming from directly behind me. I turned, but there was no one there, only the photograph, now completely blank except for Charles Lawson's face. His eyes burned with malevolence, and his smile widened into a grotesque grin. I don't remember how I got out of that house. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the snow, my breath ragged and my heart racing. The farmhouse loomed behind me, its windows dark and empty once more. But as I stared at it, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of light, like a candle burning in the upstairs bedroom. I didn't wait to find out. I ran back to my car and drove away, the sound of whispers still ringing in my ears. I never told anyone what happened that night. The Lawson farm remains abandoned, a relic of a tragedy that refuses to be forgotten. Some say it's just an old house, the shadows no different from any other. But I know better. The Lawsons are still there, trapped in a cycle of violence and grief, their souls unable to move on. And Charles, the man who took it all from them, he's still watching, waiting for his next visitor. So if you ever find yourself near Germantown on a cold December night, stay far away from the Lawson farm, because some doors are better left closed.